Okay, welcome to part two. So let's talk about the argument. What I've done is I've pulled out some individual arguments. So none of these are paragraphs, because after all, how many arguments should you have in a paragraph? I really hope you just typed the number two, because in fact, it is two or three. However, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a single argument and how the student has developed it. Okay, Nietzsche's idea that humans use morality to hide their unpleasant side is ludicrous. Okay, so what we have there is a claim that this part of Nietzsche is ludicrous. So, is it an opinion? Yes. Is it an opinion based on an understanding of the text? Okay, maybe they're going to have to prove that, but we're certainly in the ballpark. So let's take a look at what we have next. Remember, parts may not be in any given order. He mentions how people are sickly, crippled crippled animals who are hiding their true selves. He thinks that moral principles are the reasons that mankind can have a motive to be tame creatures. So, what is that? Yep, that is evidence. Now, does this evidence prove this claim? Okay, so for the most part it does. I'm not seeing ludicrous yet, but hopefully we're going to develop it. So let's take a look at the next bit. However, Nietzsche's belief about morality is too unrealistic because people will not always act in a way that is considered unpleasant. What is that? Yep, we are coming back to the student's judgment. So this is the commentary piece, okay? The commentary piece, you can see a little bit of contrast here, that the way things happen in reality is different than Nietzsche's belief because people do not act in this way. So let's take a look at the next sentence. Even though many may have different actions and thoughts that might not be considered appropriate in today's time, these do not mean they are unpleasant or threatening. What is it? Okay, it is more of this commentary. Now, in the facts here, the facts are focusing on people are sick, sickly, crippled animals who hide themselves, that moral principles are just how we, that how we pretend to be tame animals. I'm not seeing a lot of that. I have a little bit of that up here, but here I don't seem to be talking about this fact. So I'm wandering a little bit off track here. Okay. It is erroneous to assume that everyone would have a terrible side to them. So it is unreasonable and far-fetched to assume that a person's savageness would appear without their morality anymore. Okay. So again, I have contrast. And here I'm coming back to the facts. Do you see how this takes me back to those specific facts? Your commentary should always tell me, okay, why are those facts important? What do those facts have to say? And you should bring a type of reasoning to it. So, does the commentary focus on the idea of ludicrous? Because if this is good commentary, it's going to focus. However, Nietzsche's belief about morality is too unrealistic. Not quite as, why are you not willing to highlight, you little booger? Okay. Not quite as strong as ludicrous, but in the same family. About morality is unrealistic because people will not always act in a way that is considered unpleasant, even though many may have different actions and thoughts that might not be considered appropriate. Maybe appropriate is ludicrous. Might not be appropriate in today's time. These do not mean they are unpleasant or threatening. It is erroneous to assume that everyone would have a terrible side to them. So it is unreasonable and far-fetched to assume that a person's savageness would appear without their morality anymore. So is it focused on ludicrous? It is for the most part. I think it needs to be tightened up. In the middle, it wandered away from the evidence and it just sort of started talking. But overall, I would say that this is really solid commentary. It's coming back to what the opening claim is. It is talking about how these facts are important. I would like it to be focused on the facts a little bit more, because you do have those fact references in the opening and in the closing sentence, but in the middle it kind of wanders away a little bit. So this certainly would be considered a passing paragraph by any stretch of the imagination. However, I want us to take a look at assumptions. You guys have known since you were 7, 8 years old that assumptions were not particularly good things. And I want you to take a look at something. Do you see what I see? The commentary says that Nietzsche is ludicrous for assuming how people are sickly animals, that morality, that mankind has a motive to pretend to be kind of a tame animal. And yet, even though the student is calling Nietzsche out for making these assumptions, look what the student is doing. It's erroneous to assume that everyone would have a terrible side to them. I am pretty sure you are making what is it? Yes, an assumption. So, would this get past the AP test? Absolutely. Would a college professor be thrilled with this? Maybe not. And you might have a really tough time because you'd be like, but that was good enough for my high school teacher. What your college professor is going to say is you're making an assumption. If you make an assumption that your reader is going to question you on, because we all make assumptions all the time, but if you make an assumption that not everyone has a terrible side to them, if you make an assumption that the reader may have reason to challenge. So maybe the reader is really pro Nietzsche, and maybe the reader is going to be like, yes, everyone does. Even Mother Teresa had a terrible side to her. Well, you are going to have to do what's called backing. Backing is, I have made an assumption and I am going to give you backing to kind of prove that it is true. So in this case, I would say, because you've got a very strong assumption here, it's erroneous to assume that everyone will have a terrible side to them. That's an assumption. So you need to then back that up. Identifying an assumption. Hey, oh, and of course, there the dogs go. I'm not stopping for the dogs. If you identify an assumption and then back it up, and you back it up by giving an example of your assumption, that is called elaboration. Elaboration is where you bring additional evidence to the table and you elaborate on the evidence that's already there by adding more to the pile that's on the table. Now, in this case, you're saying he's wrong. So you are challenging his evidence. So here's the pile. You're going to elaborate on this by providing some evidence to prove that it is not always true. So I'm going to pretend that this is my paragraph, and I'm going to put my elaboration or my backing in there. Elaboration is one way to have what's called backing. Backing is any evidence that you are providing to prove that an assumption that you're making in commentary is true. It is erroneous to assume that everyone has a terrible side to them. My own mother certainly had flaws. However, she never would have put herself above others. She volunteered in church not to impress the congregation, but because she believed deeply in a responsibility to help her fellow human being. She was not a tame woman who put on morality to hide herself. She was an occasionally angry woman who risked her reputation to protest Native American and Vietnam veteran rights in the 70s. Clearly, not everyone is as selfish as Nietzsche suggests. So, it is unreasonable and far-fetched to assume that a person's savageness would appear without their morality anymore. Now, your next comment is going to be, oh my God, I was told I could never use personal stories. You can't use personal stories poorly. If you start just talking about yourself in order to talk about yourself, you are going to be in huge trouble. But if you notice here, the personal story is still very closely related to what's going on in that evidence. I didn't make. If this were my paragraph, I would say I made an assumption right here. And the minute I make an assumption that someone might challenge me on, I have to back that assumption up by elaborating with something to prove that I am right. In this case, could you find a more academic topic? Well, maybe. And it might be a great idea to use a more academic topic if you know enough about someone. However, you have to be very careful because you are going to be tempted to go for the big names and talk about how Mother Teresa, that she was the perfect moral person. And then somebody's going to come along and give you a little bit of a spanking because you may not know all the details about Mother Teresa's life. So if you are pulling an academic topic, make sure that it is one that you are very familiar with. If you are pulling a personal topic, you have to be careful. Make sure that you are keeping focused on Nietzsche. You bring up any topic that you need to bring up from your own life, that's fine, but only in order to further elaborate on the subject. If you get yourself distracted and just start talking about your mama and how wonderful your mama is, then you're going to be in trouble because you will have left Nietzsche behind. So that is my lesson on elaboration. If you make an assumption, you must back that assumption up with evidence. One form of evidence is elaborate by showing an example of what you mean from real life. Make sense? Okay. So let's take a look at another one. In addition to that, clearly we are talking about, this was the second argument in a paragraph. So I do like that I've got a transition there. Not the most sophisticated transition, but transitions are nice. And some of you decided you just didn't need them. It made your paragraphs a little hard to read. Okay. In addition to that, humans can become extremely dependent. Nietzsche says in his writing that once a person receives aid, they are going to keep wanting help. Okay, I shouldn't pick on this, but you've got to break this habit. How many people are there? That would be one. How many people are there? That would be more than one. Please don't do that. Easiest way to fix it, put everything into plural. That once people receive aid. Look, now the whole sentence is in plural. Yay. Okay. Nietzsche says in his writing that once people receive aid, they are going to keep wanting help. This means that ones in need will become overly dependent on those who sucker. Slightly that, look up how to use the word. Look up sample sentence sucker, and yeah, that needs to be changed. Although aiding others might seem like the right choice, it can actually do damage on both ends. The person being assisted is going to keep wanting from the other and will never truly strengthen their soul. On the other hand, the person helping will continue to have the urge to lend a hand and will not have time to focus on themselves and go through their own misfortunes. Despite the fact that Nietzsche's philosophy is harsh, it is in fact logical in more ways than one. So right now, what do you think I'm going to say about the biggest problem with this argument? Okay, so let's take a look. Humans can become extremely dependent. What is that? If it is a claim that is the student's opinion based off of the readings, if that is a summary, that is going to be what Nietzsche believes. Is that what Nietzsche believes? It really is. Now, this is kind of an easy fix. In addition to that, Nietzsche is insightful when he suggests humans can become extremely dependent. Now, this is the student's opinion. Before, when I just have, when I just have this is simply a statement of what Nietzsche believes. It's not the student's opinion about whether Nietzsche is right or wrong. Because I really don't have a very clear student opinion in there, this is not a strong claim. So you have to get a student opinion in there. So this is the opinion. Woohoo! I think Nietzsche is right. You can't just tell me what Nietzsche is saying. Okay. Nietzsche says in his writing that once people receive aid, they are going to keep wanting help. It's not strong evidence because I don't have any of those little quote fragments. So the evidence is not strong, but is that passable evidence? Well, sure. That is an accurate summary of what Nietzsche says. So let's take a look at the next. This means that the ones in need will become overly dependent on those who offer them succor. Now, is that a summary of Nietzsche, or is the student starting to offer commentary on why Nietzsche is right? Yeah, the very fact you have the transition, this means you are continuing to summarize what it is that Nietzsche has said. So that is summary. Okay. Although aiding others may seem like the right choice, it can actually do damage on both ends. Is that something that Nietzsche said? Yes, absolutely. Because Nietzsche said it distracts you from improving yourself and it prevents other people from finding their own personal heaven. So that's 100%. That's what Nietzsche said. The person being assisted is going to keep wanting from the other and will never truly strengthen their soul. Well, that's directly from Nietzsche. That whole strengthening of the soul piece. Yep, that's Nietzsche. Okay. On the other hand, the person helping will continue to have the urge to lend a hand and not have time to focus on themselves and go through their own misfortunes. Again, that is directly summarizing what Nietzsche said. The example Nietzsche even gave was that of people go to war not because they have any great moral value, but because they will pretty much do anything to avoid trying to improve themselves. Despite the fact that Nietzsche's philosophy is harsh, it is in fact logical in more ways than one. That is the first time that this actually has the student's opinion in there. This argument is really just summarizing. For it to have commentary, I would expect to have things like Nietzsche's argument is correct because if Nietzsche were wrong, this would be what would happen in the world. But that doesn't happen. Therefore, Nietzsche is right. Clearly, Nietzsche's philosophy, if applied to an individual, say a drug user, this is how his philosophy applies to that individual. And here's why it's absolutely right. If you continue to help a drug user by giving them money, by giving them shelter, then all they do is continue their bad behavior. They never work through their personal hell in order to reach their personal heaven. So there's no reasoning that takes us outside of the text. This is literally just telling me what has Nietzsche argued. So this paragraph, you have to be really careful, especially if you're agreeing. You need to look to make sure you are saying things like he's right because. If you cannot look at your sentence and say, here is the reasoning I'm using. Here's where I've had comparison. Here's where I have contrast. Here's where I say something that is not in the text, but is me bringing logic and reasoning from outside the text and applying it to the text. If you have nothing from outside the text, no comparison, no contrast, no cause, no effect, no prediction, no elaboration, then that means literally you do not have an argument. You have a summary. Now, if this is yours, don't feel bad because lots of people did this. I wouldn't have picked a summary paragraph or a summary argument if this were not the case. And it can be fixed quite easily. So, I am going to get rid of all of this summary. Well, not all of it. Get rid of this summary. And then we're going to put in a type of reasoning. So maybe as reasoning, we want to talk about, let me get rid of, there we go. Maybe as reasoning, we want to do a contrast. Says in his writing that once people receive aid, they're going to keep wanting help. This means the ones in need will become overly dependent on those who offer succor. Although aiding others may seem like the right choice, it can actually do damage on both ends. Nietzsche is absolutely correct. His theories can be seen in every drug-dependent family in the United States. When a parent offers too much help, that parent prevents a drug addicted child from suffering homelessness, withdrawal, or prison time. And by preventing the suffering, the parent ensures that the child remains dependent. on them for money. Now, all of a sudden, I've switched into comparison. Let me compare Nietzsche's very sort of philosophical position to a real life example. So, one of the big things I'm going to tell you is if you're struggling, change the magnification. If what you are trying to prove right or wrong is a big picture, then turn the magnifying glasses on and focus on what would that look like in a specific example. If the person you're trying to agree with is giving you a very specific example, then kind of broaden back out and look at what would that look like from a greater distance, a more academic distance. So sometimes if you change the magnification level, it will be easier for you to stop summarizing and to figure out how to get in that reasoning or that logic. But this is comparison reasoning. And of course, you would then need to come back to Nietzsche is insightful, and here's why he's right. And I would do that a little bit more before I finished. But you can see here that if you are really struggling when you go to do comparisons, because my guess is that's what the person thought they were doing. They were comparing their views to Nietzsche when in reality, they were just telling us Nietzsche's views. If you are doing comparison, your biggest trick is to change the magnification level. If your author is giving you big picture, you go specific. If your author gives you specific, you go big picture. But that commentary, you cannot simply tell me what it is that Nietzsche says. You have to tell me why you believe Nietzsche is right. Deal? Okay, let's do another one. Okay, this one a little bit longer. Throughout his work, Nietzsche prioritizes a lack of compassion, thus endorsing a selfish society. He compares two types of people, one strong and the other weak, and claims that domination of the stronger over the weaker is necessary. Consequently, no pity should be given to the latter, as he has the desire to be coveted and wishes to become a function. Furthermore, Nietzsche enforces the idea that compassion stems from the desires of the dear sympathizer to alleviate the struggles of their neighbor rather than allow them to suffer, which ultimately stunts their growth. Okay, that is all Nietzsche. That's a little bit long, could be tightened up a little bit, but so far, really, really accurate description of Nietzsche's ideas. If people were to abide by these maxims, ding, 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 already I know what kind of reasoning they're going into. Do you know what kind of reasoning they're going into? Yeah. If you were going to study, I have just suggested that you are not studying, because if she were to do that, it's suggesting she hasn't, which means this is going to be contrast commentary. So I should be able to see a reasoning type just that easily. So let's see what they do with contrast. If people were to abide by these maxims, societies would eventually be decimated. Because citizens would compete with one another to obtain power, there would not be healthy relationships within a community. Also, there would be a lack of aid for those who are less fortunate or enduring hardships. Consequently, people in power would reside in a position of privilege, while generations of families continued to struggle in poverty. With Nietzsche's ideal of one man for himself, the stability of a nation would collapse and chaos would erupt as people are not held accountable for their greedy, impractical actions. Nice. Very nice. So you have contrast. If people were to do that, you then have prediction that this is what would happen to a society if everyone did that. Now, in this case, I think you don't need backing. You don't need to back up your assumptions, because I think it's pretty self-evident that if everyone is out for themselves, that society would collapse into chaos. If an assumption is something that your reader is going to go, yeah, you're kind of right, then you don't have to have backing. Could you add backing if you wanted to? Sure, I could, right after this, I could say something like, and this is, and Nazi Germany is the perfect example of this. Hitler idolized Nietzsche and saw himself as being the ultimate ideal of Nietzsche's Superman, who understood his own value and understood what it was to take control of himself. Well, clearly Nazi Germany was the society that embraced Nietzsche, that had no regard for the weak, that thought that they could take whatever they wanted, and that society collapsed dreadfully. And in fact, is still held up as an example of how to not run a country. So you could certainly back that up rather easily if you wanted to, particularly if you knew the historical connections between Nietzsche and Hitler, which, by the way, you can't blame Nietzsche for. But yeah, Hitler did kind of think he was the man. So one of the things to keep in mind, first of all, the commentary here, really, really good. But are you always going to have assumptions in your commentary? You always are. But what you have to ask yourself is that an assumption that makes sense by itself? Or are readers going to read that and go, oh, I don't know? Do you have to back up your assumptions? In this case, I would say you don't, because I think most people are going to go, yep, yeah, that's going to collapse into chaos. That's not going to work well. And amazingly enough, it didn't work well. Okay, last one. Oh, you know what? Let's skip ahead to this one. One may argue that Nietzsche has detestable ideas, such as letting those who suffer endure it alone. However, this is another clever ideal of his because it allows people to reach true contentment. To explain, Nietzsche believes that when a person suffers, it is incomprehensible and inaccessible to everyone else. Therefore, no one can truly understand their suffering, and that one's own heaven is only achievable through one's own hell. Meaning, if someone could understand another's suffering, they should let them conquer their hardship alone. Although it is against human nature to deny someone succor during their hardship, Nietzsche explains that people need to go through suffering alone in order to truly reach not only their full potential, but contentment with life. Right now, what am I going to say about that evidence? Yeah, it's a little long. Longer is not better, especially with evidence. Remember the rule that your commentary is at least as long as, if not longer than, your evidence? Yeah, this could be trimmed up a lot. But let's take a look at here. Do you have, and by the way, this is in the middle of the paragraph. Do you have a claim? Yeah, Nietzsche is clever. That is the student's opinion that they are going to have to prove. The next thing is, what kind of argument structure are you seeing? Do you see what I see? That is a rebuttal setup. Here's your concession. Some people say that Nietzsche has these detestable ideas. However, those ideas are actually clever. And I'm going to start proving it. Please watch your punctuation. That is a conjunctive adverb. This week, we are going to be practicing our grammar. So hopefully it's going to be cleaner after this week. So this is a concession. Here is your claim, which is leading into your rebuttal. You then have all of this evidence. If you try telling me your commentary is going to start here, I'm going to tell you, no, it isn't, because this is still summarizing what Nietzsche believes. So let's take a look at commentary. To elaborate, That's a little awkward because you haven't given me any commentary to elaborate on. Elaboration is usually done when you are identifying an opinion and then elaborating, giving that opinion backing by elaborating on the arguments. But you're starting your argument and you're telling me elaboration. Awkward, a little bit. Okay. People who endure suffering will become stronger from the painful experience. After going through hell, people will finally conquer their suffering and enable their heaven by themselves and be content with life. Would Nietzsche say people who endure suffering will become stronger? Yes. Did Nietzsche say this? Yes. In fact, there are quotes in there. This is exactly what Nietzsche would say. Okay. Well, they told me they were going to have commentary, but then maybe not. Okay, let's take a look. When contentment is handed to someone, they will never truly be happy because they will attribute others for their own joy. Did Nietzsche say that? Yep. Although seeing others suffer compels mankind to help those in need. Did he say that? Yep, he was talking about the war example. Offering aid ultimately does them a disservice. Does Nietzsche say that? Yep. Your opinion is that Nietzsche is clever. Where in there do they talk about why he is clever? Yeah. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? That is what we call a fatal flaw. Instead of having an actual argument, it's just summarizing what Nietzsche says. Okay. That is different than, let's pull out some lines here. This writing is very practical because it tells humans they must take responsibility for their misfortunes. That Nietzsche never says, hey, I'm very practical. But here, he also states that giving indemnity, he also states that is a signal that you're about to have summary. Nietzsche believes. Does that suggest we're about to have summary or commentary? That's leading us into summary. Okay. So what you have to be careful of is, and in this one, what it's going to come down to, this one has a little bit of commentary, but it still has entirely too much summary. You have to make sure that if you are telling me Nietzsche is right, do not simply say, here's what he said. It's great. You have to tell me why. Why is it right? What can you compare it to? What can you contrast it against? What do you think it will lead to? What predictions can you make? Can you elaborate? And if you really get stuck, change the magnification. Get very specific in your commentary so that you can take his general ideas and apply them to something specific. But I would say the number one problem in the papers overall is that I have entirely too much summary. So the two of you that got pulled because that's summary, don't feel bad, because quite frankly, yeah, that I would say probably 60% of papers I saw had too much summary going on. And if I look just at the people who agree with Nietzsche, of the people who agree with Nietzsche, probably 80 to 90% had too much summary because he really phrases things well. And it's easy to get excited and say, yeah, instead of saying, yeah, because. And you have to get that because in there. Why do you agree with him? So that is the workshop on content. Hopefully at this point you can go. I want you to evaluate your own paragraph, go through and try and highlight each sentence and ask yourself, does this have a type of reasoning or am I simply telling you what Nietzsche's position is? How much do you tell me what Nietzsche's position is and how much do you actually make your own arguments about why you think he's right and why you think he's wrong? So I will see you guys later. Go evaluate yourself. Have some fun. Hopefully you learn some stuff.